Hi, I'm Allison Grayson with Independent Sector, and welcome to this Week in Washington, where we discuss advocacy and public policy that impact nonprofits during the COVID-19 pandemic. For those of you who are joining us for the first time on this call, welcome. Today, we're joined by Brent Never with the University of Missouri-Kansas City and Washington Council Ernst & Young's Wes Coulam. A little bit of direction for today. As a part of our call feature, all lines are currently muted. We will pause periodically for questions. So to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box in the Zoom feature, or you can email publicpolicy@independentsector.org. This event will be recorded and will be posted on the Independent Sector website and emailed to you within 24 hours after the webinar concludes. When you leave today's call, you will be prompted with a survey. Please take it if you can find the time. It really will help us tailor future content to meet your needs. And we look forward to your questions today. So we're going to start with a new feature on our call. And I wanted to respectfully acknowledge that I am joining you from Alexandria, Virginia. It is the ancestral home of the Piscataway people, and they still are living in the area and working to reclaim their land and traditional practices. I also want to acknowledge that the metropolitan area and Alexandria, Virginia, where I am in particular, we inhabit a lot of buildings and other community infrastructure that were built by enslaved people. So this is something that we're working to acknowledge, all the communities that sort of provide the infrastructure on which we are able to do our work. And also, since this is a policy call, I'd love to acknowledge that Native and tribal communities often are overlooked in public policy. Their unique needs are often overlooked when we develop public policies. And as a best practice, I know from an independent sector standpoint, we're going to try to be much more diligent in the future when thinking about and evaluating public policy impact as a whole on nonprofits in the communities we serve, which is the conversation today around the PPP program, that we pay special attention to communities with unique needs like tribal and indigenous communities. So thank you everybody for joining us. Now, I'm excited to kick off the program with Wes Coulam. Wes, you're going to tell us what, if anything, is happening in Washington, D.C. this week.
Thanks, Allison. Well, it could be said there's lots going on, but also not a lot going on. There is we're in the state of negotiations on a next phase of legislation for recovery and relief due to the coronavirus. Maybe just a little bit of a backdrop. We've had, I think, 4 pieces of legislation passed since March. Some small appropriations legislation, some paid family leave legislation, and obviously the large CARES Act in March that included the PPP loan program we're going to talk about today for smaller employers, 500 employees or less. Other programs through the Fed and Treasury for larger employers that have been rolling out last several weeks and months, but not been very effective or helpful to the nonprofit sector. And then we've had extensions, for example, initial plus up in funds for the PPP program that Congress has passed as they've seen that program receive some high demand and need to modify it and extend it out to this month of August. And so that's been kind of the mode of operation for Congress the last several months, is kind of passing individual pieces of legislation, large pieces of legislation, and smaller tweaks as they go along. We're now in a phase of trying to negotiate between the House, the Senate, and the White House, a next phase package for relief. In May, the House passed a large $3+ trillion package called the HEROES Act that had a number of new appropriations in there for state and local governments. It had new lending programs for relief for individuals, renters, healthcare workers, healthcare industry support. It also had expansions of the current PPP program for small employers. It had also in there some targeted relief for nonprofits and lending facilities and loan forgiveness in there, as well as expansions of the current tax incentives for employers through employee retention tax credit, for example, as well as additional relief for individuals through a tax rebate modeled after what happened and was passed in March as part of the CARES Act. So that was passed in May by the House, a large package that had lots of different provisions in there, spending and the tax side. And then we've been waiting for the Senate to release their proposal, which they have the last couple of weeks. Response to that, Leader McConnell put out with Republicans in the Senate, the HEALS Act that had various components to it, similar to some of the items that were in the HEROES Act, but on a much smaller scale. Includes some expansions of the PPP program to expand that, special tax rebates for individuals, additional expansion of the retention tax credit for employers, and some other things in that package, liability relief for employers, businesses, including nonprofits, for liability relief from lawsuits related to other employees coming back to work due to COVID-19. As well as other aspects dealing with the unemployment insurance program that expired this last week, $600 increase in employment insurance benefits above and beyond what the states pay out as a federal additional incentive. That was part of the CARES Act that expired last week, and they're trying to figure out a way to extend that either on the smaller level or for a short-term basis over the next couple of weeks or months. And so we've been kind of watching the negotiations taking place between, for the most part, it's been led by the White House with Chief of Staff Meadows and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, negotiating with Speaker Pelosi and Senate Democratic Leader Charles Schumer to try to see if they can figure out a way to reach an agreement on a package between the two versions that have been out there. The HEROES Act in the House and the HEALS Act, the Republican version in the Senate. There's been some back and forth on proposals, really focusing on the big issues that have been sticking points. One is the unemployment insurance extension expired, as I mentioned, the last week, as well as state and local government funding in there, as well as what else to do on some of these loan programs, the PPP loan program that has bipartisan support. We expand that and how to deal with that on a going forward basis. Also product liability, or sorry, employer liability protection is also a big issue that the Republicans have been pushing for in the Senate and the administration, and they're trying to figure out a way to bridge the gap on that. Looks to me like they're not going to reach a deal certainly this next couple of days, but they're kind of probably working to the weekend. Leader McConnell said that probably the Senate will probably be in next week. We could see Senator McConnell try to move to force some votes on some issues on the Senate floor. But it's not going to go anywhere until they reach an agreement with the Democrats and the White House on a larger package. And so it's kind of where we are in the state of play, kind of watching and waiting to see what comes out of the negotiations between the White House and the House and Senate Democrats for the most part in the next several days and probably into next week is my sense before we see a final resolution to these negotiations.
Thanks, Wes. So there's a lot of negotiations happening. A lot of it's trying to resolve differences between two bills. There are some priorities for the sector that were not included in either bill. And so I'm kind of curious about the status of that. And also, you know, in addition to sort of the Relief for Charities campaign, independent sector had been working with an infrastructure coalition to advance broadband, elections, and census funding. It actually seems like some of those are a little more promising, and then some of our other more nonprofit specific priorities beyond PPP may have a little more challenges. Can you just elaborate sort of like where we think we are in the chances of some of these provisions? Are they even in the conversation, I guess, is a good indicator.
Yeah, I think that's I think there's some good chances of getting some things in there. The question is what and to what extent. I think the PPP loan program has bipartisan support. I think there will be some expansions in there and some modifications to that. You know, I think there would be hopes that would increase the size amount from 500, something higher than that. I think that's probably a tough ask at this point, but they'll probably put some more money for the program, maybe make the loan forgiveness aspects of it more generous for those who do qualify, and maybe even have a blanket of forgiveness for those making under $150,000 in loan amounts. So it's kind of take the small loans and just allow them to be fully forgiven without having to deal with the complication of the applications and oversight of that forgiveness aspect. In the neither in the House nor Senate bills, there's a In the CARES Act, there was $300 above line deduction for charitable contributions. I've been trying to get that increased through the efforts of the sector. No increase is included in either the House or Senate versions, and so that's an effort ongoing. It looks like a tough lift to get something substantial in there, given it's not either the House or Senate bills. They're trying to keep the cost of the program and the package down between the two proposals. As you mentioned, also there's election funding in there for election funding. So I think it's kind of there's bipartisan support for doing that for election security, but it's also kind of caught up in the current debate about mail-in ballots and the back and forth going on both sides on that issue. I think on the broadband piece, the broadband funding that was in the Senate or the House HEROES Act, I think there's some good bipartisan support for doing something in that space. That's a good chance. I think the issue though is that the negotiations are kind of focusing on the top line issues, unemployment insurance, state and local government funding, liability protections, and then everything below that kind of get done, after they figure out the big issues and move on to those. So we kind of have to wait and see if they reach a deal on the larger package or larger proposals when they turn to those, second tier issues, if you will, and how those kind of play out. I think there's a good chance of getting some broadband funding in there as part of this package, but we'll see.
Great, thanks, Wes. We don't think they're second tier, but we understand they're big priorities for policymakers. Exactly. So I'm really excited today to have Brent Never join us. He's the associate professor of public affairs with the Henry W. Block School of Management at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Brent, thank you for joining us, because I think this is really timely to have this conversation. So the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP program, is a loan program that the SBA created, and for the first time included nonprofits as eligible participants in the program due to COVID. And that actually only happened because of folks on this call who did a lot of advocacy to tell Congress we need to make sure nonprofits have access to aid as well. So that happened in the spring, and then the SBA just released some data a couple weeks ago about who actually received loans. And so yourself and some others in the academic community are already busy looking at that data and trying to evaluate. So what did that look like? Who received loans? What kinds of organizations were they? How effective was it? How do nonprofits compare to for-profits? Because I think we'll get into this, but there may be a little more data available in some respects for the for-profits, or more lessons learned for the for-profits than nonprofits potentially at this time. But all that's really important to understand as Congress is debating expansion of the program, right? This is really important information. Maybe we should just ask legislative staffers to join this call today, because what you have to impart should be informing these deliberations. So without further ado, let's first let you introduce, I'm so excited. Let's first let you introduce yourself and your role at UMKC, and then we'll dive into the nitty gritty of the PPP program. I did forget to mention one thing. I transitioned a little too seamlessly. So for folks on the call, Wes just kind of ran through a lot of things that are happening in negotiations. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of the call for both Brent and Wes. Feel free, while what Wes said is top of mind, to go ahead and start entering questions into the Q&A box, and then we'll get to it in a few minutes. But I want to make sure you get a chance to capture your thoughts before we get really deep into the PPP program analysis. So now, Brent, take it away.
Thanks, Allison. I really appreciate it. And this, as Wes has said, is a really important program for our economy as a whole. And then you think about nonprofits, most definitely have taken advantage of this program. So to answer your first question, I'm Brent Never. I'm a professor of public policy here at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. And also I'm sort of a data hound, like a lot of folks. And my interest really came from the fact that this is a spectacular change in our economy in the past several months that we're all living through. And I was heartened to see that in mid-March, we were able to get the CARES Act through and to have nonprofits included in this important program under the CARES Act. So that was a tremendous feat for nonprofits, inclusive of independent sector in your activities. So with that, just the broad contours of the PPP loan program is, this is now $650 billion worth of funding, generally for any firm under the size of 500 employees. There are certain sectors where it can be higher than 500 employees. It gets technical. The SBA has, or the Small Business Administration has laid out certain sectors where generally just firms are larger, and therefore you can qualify for these loans also. The initial sort of tranche or piece was $350 billion in March. It's funny to think about the fact that $350 billion before this year would have been a very sizable amount of money. But this year it actually was used very quickly. So as many of the people online know, there was a race to get those loans. And the way the money was moved out into our economy was through federally insured lending institutions. So whether it's a federally insured bank or a federally insured credit union. So a very decentralized process. One that I think a lot of folks would say was very much touch and go, and one that created a lot of angst for nonprofits and for-profits when it first happened. So I can go into some of the contours of what we see in this data that was reported by the SBA. So at the beginning of the month, July 7th, the SBA let the data go. I think that this was kicking and screaming. That's just my intuition. But it was written into the CARES Act that it would be out there. And so I think they put in a format that was hard to use. That's just my personal opinion. But as I know other government programs, this is kind of maybe how it happens. So about 660,000 firms, that's nonprofit and for-profit. So when I say firm, it's just any organization accessed a loan above $150,000. So the data they released on July 7th was fully reported for those larger size loans of 150,000 and above. I know we'll talk about some analysis that some friends have done on the smaller loans below 150,000, but generally I'll speak to the larger ones. Of that, nonprofits received about 40,000 of those loans. So that is less than 10%. It's a smaller slice of the economy than we would have expected nonprofits would receive. But we do have to kind of keep in mind that nonprofits trend smaller than other for-profit firms. So a lot of them might have fallen below that $150,000 sort of waterline. And I do think it's important to know that, the amount you qualified for was dependent on the wages that you would pay over a 10-week period. So the bigger your organization, the more you would receive. So when we're looking at those 40,000 nonprofits, what we end up seeing is that about 10,000 of them, about a quarter of them, were religious organizations, which is interesting for me for a number of reasons. But clearly, religious organizations are nonprofits by and large. When we look at the size of loans, nonprofits actually tend to have had slightly larger loans than I would have thought. So if we think about the largest loans, those are $5 to $10 million. Nonprofit, 407 nonprofits got those largest loans versus 4,400 for-profit firms. So about 10%, a little less than 10%, got those largest loans. And what we can do with this data is start to really dig into comparisons across industries, because one thing the SBA did for us was they included what's called the North American Industry Code. This kind of tells you what sector these organizations are in. So now we're able to compare, for example, nursing care between for-profits and nonprofits. We're able to compare hospitals if they were able to qualify, educational institutions and the like. So, you know, it really is a tremendous amount of data, and we can really glean a lot about the sector and also how it compares to the for-profit.
So Brent, you mentioned your colleagues at the Johnson Center at Grand Valley State University also did some analysis, and for them, they kind of took a different approach in that they tried to compare it to sort of an estimated total amount of nonprofits that are who would have been eligible to apply for the program, and therefore total amount of jobs that would have been eligible to be saved, and they made some conclusions from that. What I think is interesting is they kind of talked about how using that methodology, they think that maybe the larger nonprofits may have fared pretty well in their ability to access PPP loans, but perhaps smaller nonprofits did not. So I'm just curious, you also did some pretty robust analysis around what it meant for for-profit institutions that were led by people of color, and saw some disparities there. And so I'm just curious, what do you make of, without having done the Johnson Center research, but sort of your reactions to that, and maybe how that complements some of the research you saw, and that maybe these high-level numbers may, there may be more beneath that we want to explore.
Absolutely. So I want to direct people to Johnson Center at Grand Valley State, as they did some great work with those smaller loans, so 150,000 and below. And this is, you know, again, the SBA sort of made the data kind of hard to crack open. They did it by state, and so plus territories, right? So Guam, Puerto Rico, and the like. So 57 separate files that you had to merge all together. And then they didn't give the actual firm that got the results. So they aggregated it to the state. So in Missouri, X amount got a loan, and Y amount, you know, for Y amount. But the Grand Valley folks at the Johnson Center, like you said, were able to say that those smaller loans did save quite a robust amount of jobs. So, you know, this is something that is important to say, that, you know, they estimate about 4 million jobs were saved in the nonprofit sector because of these loans, at a time when people were clearly in crisis, and that was tremendous. What we can say about the loans from my analysis is that by and large, they underrepresented minority populations as far as where they were located. So I'm a geographer, I love maps. And so I was able to map out the location of for-profit and nonprofit loans. So, you know, for example, looking at the Dallas Metroplex, what you see is the areas with the highest minority populations had the lowest percentage of loans, even though nonprofits were located there. So we're also able to see that from this data, the SBA does put on there whether it's a Black-owned business, a women's-owned business, Hispanic-owned business, and the like. I'll give you an example from Kansas City. About 6,600 loans here in our region, of which 24 went to Black-owned businesses. So in our region, about a third of the population is African American. So it's a very small percentage. And kind of the conclusion that I can give is that this is more an indictment of the way our economy is structured, and not an indictment of a lender or how this was constructed. You know, you had to have an access to a banking institution. You had to have had a good relationship with the banking institution, because particularly at the beginning, they really restricted who could get the loans at the bank level. And therefore, I think there was a lot of fall off with a lot of organizations that said this just not happening for me, and I'm not going to do it. So a lot deep down in the data that we can say about how this got out to a lot of the communities we serve as nonprofits.
So one of the things that I really liked about your analysis, Brent, so I've received some questions after I started talking about the fact that there's data out there analyzing, we'll call it the effectiveness of the program, asking specifically about nonprofits led by people of color. And one of the interesting things that I remember in a conversation I had with you is saying, I don't know if we can put a lot of stock in any analysis in that kind of data because of the way the SBA structured the application is still built for businesses. So it's asking, is the owner a person of color? Is the owner a woman? And that doesn't really translate into nonprofit reality, right? The nonprofits don't have an owner. And so it's hard to feel confident at the accuracy in which, nonprofits would have completed that question. And a lot of most nonprofits chose not to answer it at all. So the fact that you're able to do mapping to show where the loans went and that they go to communities of color, to low-income communities, or at least institutions that are situated there, I think is really telling for us, given sort of a flaw in the general data collection process with SBA. So that being said, the SBA did collect more data than they released. And I know we've had conversations about, what else you might be able to do if we were sort of able to advocate to the SBA, hey, could you maybe not even publicly release, maybe just privately released to researchers with an understanding, that we'll only release aggregated data. I'm just curious, what else could we learn about the relative effectiveness of the SBA program, the SBA PPP program, if we were able to get the SBA to release a little more data?
Yeah, one of the easiest things that they could do in release would be the EIN number, right? So for all organizations that apply that are not sole proprietors under a social security number, you put in your EIN number. They did not include that. That is one of the real problems. We have a name of an organization and we have an address. With that number, we're able to then link it up to the tax files. So we're able to say a lot more about the organizations. For example, I look at financially distressed organizations to say, did this get to organizations under distress? Or likewise, did it save the savable? So those are, rival hypotheses. Also we can say a lot about how our economy is structured. You think about daycares, a for-profit, nonprofit, hospice, for-profit, nonprofit. We can say so much from this data, and really this can be timely. We're able to turn around this analysis, Johnson Center, myself, and my center, within days, such that hopefully we can help Wes and the rest of the advocates to say there's so much more and so much more targeting we can do with this money if that truly is what we want to do.
So in addition to the EIN numbers, I know other things that we had talked about is you think it would be helpful if they could release not only sort of whose loan application was accepted, but who applied, to see if there's a differentiation between the kinds of organizations that did not receive a loan versus those who did. And also the loan forgiveness, I think, and that gets at sort of the financial risk, because you had said, Brent, it's possible that those organizations that don't get loans forgiven may have been better off not applying for this program at all. And that would be really important for us to know, important for groups like independent sector to know. So in the future, if there's a program like this, we can give better advice to organizations about whether or not this program is well suited for them.
That's right. So I think the next sort of analysis that really will help is this forgiveness data. There was a rush to the bank, as I said. We all tried to access those loans as quickly as possible without having the luxury to be sort of strategic and say, is this where our organization wants to go? And there's a big difference on a balance sheet between a credit, which is a forgiven loan, right? So that is like a grant, and a debit, which would be a loan you have to pay back. That is night and day. And that frankly could affect nonprofits and for-profit firms as they try to exit this pandemic. And so, it really raises the troubling question of, would organizations have been better off furloughing employees, having them have that robust unemployment benefit, and then being able to be strategic about how to exit this than taking a loan that stays on the books as a loan. And that could be troubling.
I mean, these are important things for us to learn for sure. I have another question, one last question for you, Brent. I might pose it to both you and Wes. And before I do, I want to go ahead and flag, this is the time, if the audience, if you have questions you want to ask Brent and Wes, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box. We're happy to, we're running a little bit over, but I think they're willing to stay on for a few extra minutes to answer a couple of questions. So please feel free to do that. So my last question is, Brent, based on the analysis you've seen so far, Wes, this is might be the first time you're hearing about some of this, so I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but not necessarily for the purposes of advocacy right now in terms of the PPP program and its expansion, but if the federal government needed to create this kind of aid program in the future, and in particular, we want that program to serve nonprofits, what are we starting to learn from the data that would tell us how we could improve upon this kind of program or process the next time around?
Yeah. So I
Brent first, because
yeah,
I don't know.
Very
Wes
quickly,
saw this coming.
I'll let Wes jump in too. But I think, for me, the image is, sometimes you see on TV in an emergency, where in the emergency room, they're squeezing the IV bag into somebody who has a bad injury. This is really what it was, right? We were trying to squeeze the capital into organizations as quickly as possible, whether it was efficient or not. Now we have the ability to really step back and say, God, did that, did that capital go where we wanted it to? And one thing that might not be as politically viable, but to be more useful, is not to have this run to the bank sort of mentality, to say more like an FDIC mentality. Your savings account is protected no matter what by the FDIC. So you're not running to the bank if you think it's going to go under. Likewise, with this type of injection of capital, we will service every loan that comes across, whether or not it gets filed on the first day or the last day. And therefore, you have organizations being able to be a little more strategic about what should we ask for, can we tailor it? And so, I would really suggest, better messaging, frankly, too. To how this money will get squeezed out into the economy.
Any reactions to that, Wes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I agree with Brent's response. Just one thing to think about is that nonprofits kind of have two sides to them, right? They're obviously very different than for-profit regular businesses. Businesses have income coming in, they hire employees, but they also have products and stuff they sell and services, etc. Nonprofits have income coming in from basically two sources, right? Revenue from their operations or donations. They also have grant funding from the government or other nonprofit organizations themselves. And so a little bit of an animal in how they receive their funding than a traditional company who basically just goes out and does a service or sells a product and they get that revenue coming in. They're also trying to squeeze nonprofits into a SBA program that was traditionally only used for for-profit businesses. Nonprofits were not allowed and not qualified for SBA 7A loans, which is the program they're using for PPP programs. They're trying to kind of fit an entire industry into this business model, if you will. It's kind of a little bit awkward. But they need to recognize that nonprofits serve important function in society, but they're also employers. And so the need for them to be, in the sense, during the economy and the shutdown of the economy, also take care of their employees as employers, as well as keep their lights on and operate their services and their activities. And so I think from a going forward perspective, think about what went wrong and what's better. Maybe there's a way to think about how we can kind of better improve the government's response and assistance to nonprofit organizations on a going forward basis, rather than try to pigeonhole them into a business model that doesn't really fit.
Agree. Have a question. I'm going to pose it to you, Wes, first. Brent, if you have thoughts, please feel free to jump in. What barriers do you see to expanding the 500 employee cap or other expansions to the PPP program?
Good question. There has been conversation around raising that 500 employee cap. And as Brent mentioned in his comments, there is exceptions to that rule for certain industries. Doesn't apply to nonprofits, but does apply to some, hotel and restaurant businesses, et cetera, that they got a higher employee count under the program. One problem, frankly, is that they are kind of targeting PPP towards smaller businesses. There was some, bad publicity about some larger corporations or publicly traded or had multiple franchises, for example, that got some loans. Part of that was intended. They didn't realize they'd get bad press for it. And part of it was just they didn't really think about how it would apply in that context. One other barrier, quite frankly, and I hate to say this, is that the Republicans are not happy to see Planned Parenthood get a loan through the PPP. And so that's one thing that's been raised. If they expand it, then they would include them, which is unfortunate, but that's kind of what's been out there as one pushback. And so they're trying to find ways to increase it or modify it without expanding to that status. So they did, in the CARES Act, they did have two programs: one PPP program for smaller businesses, 500 or less, and they had also a mid-size loan program run through Treasury and the Fed. That kind of goes to my earlier point, is that the Treasury and Fed are used to dealing with for-profit businesses and how their operations work, how their balance sheet operates. And so the Fed program is just not usable, even though I tried to include nonprofits in the program, just not usable the way it's structured for nonprofits. And so they need to find a way to, help nonprofits that's more targeted and more appropriate for the sector as they're structured.
Great. Brent, anything to add?
Yeah, I think this does actually impact nonprofits quite a lot. People, typically think of nonprofits as your cuddly church basement, food pantry sort of operation. But, if you think about sectors such as hospitals, higher eds and meds, they're hurting in a lot of ways in this economy. And so thinking about this cap is important. But Wes, I think you really are educating me about the politics of who gets this money. Of course, with these industry codes, I could find all sorts of for-profit firms in industries that we may not think are absolutely great getting these loans. In fact, I think I'm going to do that right after this call. But to be absolutely honest, I think that right now, I would push towards the other end of the size spectrum. How do we, again, push money further down to really a lot of these smaller sole proprietorships, smaller organizations, because they're the ones who expend money immediately, right? I mean, they're spending it right away. And if that's the intention of these loans, is to push money into our economy and keep people safe, that would be more interesting to me.
Thank you so much. We're definitely over time. We do have another question. I actually think it's going to be a really quick answer for Wes, so I'm still going to ask it, and then we're going to wrap up pretty quickly. Wes, there's a question about the status of the CORES Act. Is it being considered? So this is about national service. Is it, or elements of it, being considered in any of the negotiations around this next COVID package?
Good question. I have not seen it be raised in the negotiations. And this kind of goes to the issue of at what point do they start moving down the list of things they have on their agenda to deal with. And part of the problems with some of the issues that might not have as much headline attention is time might run out. If they agree to some of the bigger issues, to get those they've been tough to reach a deal on unemployment insurance, for example, and state and local government funding. If they get reach a deal on that, there's going to be a lot of pressure to just wrap it up and tie everything else up and get the bill drafted and signed, passed and signed into law. Because there are going to be a good week of negotiation, or a good week of actual voting on the House and Senate floor. Once the bill's actually drafted and agreed to actually get it processed into the president's desk. And so they're going to want to move that pretty quick. And so the problem with that is that some of these issues that may not be in the forefront might get, unfortunately, left behind. So I've not heard it be talked about. And so I'd be concerned that it might not make it in the final process.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Brent and Wes. Thank you all for joining us and hanging in there. Sort of a little bit past our normal break time, but this is really interesting and timely conversation. So I hope everybody has a great afternoon, and I hope you'll join us again for our next call.